As I mentioned in the first of this lecture, the first video of this lecture, the 1950s was a segregated, unequal society. Half of the black population in the United States lived in poverty. They were always the first to lose their jobs before whites. And even though, and I mentioned this earlier too, that even though there was no legal segregation in the North, they were still kind of forced into separate spaces. Things were still kind of, instead of de jure segregation, which is segregation by law, in the North you have really de facto segregation, which is more like by practice. In 1950, 17 states had laws with segregated schools, and 40% of students in 40% of African American students were in legally segregated schools. And in the North, many schools are also segregated, but again, by the de facto segregation. And, just many whites just were not concerned about it. And certainly Truman, during his presidency, ignored the segregation issue. And Eisenhower was really reluctant to take on civil rights. And so the early part of the civil rights movement really fell to the courts. The NAACP pressed a lot of legal challenges to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision from 1898 that legally established separate but equal. Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer, a really important lawyer for the NAACP. At first, they worked to gain African American admission into colleges, but then pivoted to local cases that targeted K-12 schools and really focused their arguments on unequal funding to attack that separate but equal doctrine. And so the pivotal court case came with Brown v. Board of Education. And this decision kind of was a precedent, or not necessarily a precedent, but it was a sign of things to come under the court of Earl Warren. Earl Warren is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and you see a lot of progressive decisions that happen as a result of him being Chief Justice. So Brown versus Board was the first legal precedent to overthrow Plessy v. Ferguson, saying that separate but equal was not actually the way that things were happening. And so this leads to the desegregation of schools. But this court case didn't address segregation outside of public schools, and it certainly didn't impact the de facto segregation that was happening in the North. Other ways in which African Americans started to attack segregation, one of those things was through the buses, specifically in Montgomery, Alabama. We all have heard of Rosa Parks sparking a one-year bus boycott that really kind of became the beginning of the mass phase of the civil rights movement in the South. Parks is often kind of represented as this kind of unassuming woman who just kind of stood up for keeping her space on that bus. But realistically, Parks was a veteran of Black politics. She had been involved in African American politics back into the 1930s, and she was an active member of the NAACP. Through the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery bus boycott in November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregating public transportation was unconstitutional as well. And then this also launched a nonviolent crusade based in Black churches in the South and started to gain support of Northern liberals. And this is where we see the emergence of Martin Luther King Jr. as the movement's kind of national symbol. From the success of the boycott in 1956, Martin Luther King formed the SCLC, which was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a coalition of Black ministers and other civil rights activists that went on a crusade, essentially, to press for desegregation. The bus boycotts that had been happening kind of showed that local action was not enough. But at the same time, in 1956, you have a group of Southern congressmen, 82 out of the 106 Southern congressmen, that signed the Southern Manifesto that denounced the Brown decision, called it an abuse of power on the part of the Supreme Court, and called for resistance to forced integration. And so what you saw throughout the South happening was states passing laws that would actually block desegregation and blocked NAACP action to ensure that integration was happening. Eisenhower largely stayed out of the racial struggle, and he really failed to provide moral leadership. He failed to act in 1956 when the University of Alabama refused to admit a black student with a federal court order. But in 1957, when the Arkansas government used the National Guard to prevent integration of schools, Eisenhower actually sent federal troops to escort the 9 students into the school. But because of massive resistance and the Southern Manifesto, the pace of the movement slowed quite a bit in the final years of the 1950s. When Eisenhower left office, fewer than 2% of black students were attending desegregated schools in states in the old Confederacy. But 1960 really changed things. Eisenhower was unable to run for re-election. And this became the closest election in American history. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, who had been Eisenhower's vice president, and the Democrats went with a new up-and-coming politician by the name of John F. Kennedy. Both of these men were ardent Cold Warriors, but John F. Kennedy was Catholic. We'd never elected a Catholic to the presidency before, and he was 43. He was the youngest nominee that we'd ever had. Not the youngest president, because Teddy Roosevelt was younger when he became president, but he was the youngest nominee that we'd ever had. And Kennedy, in his advertisements and speeches, used Sputnik and other Soviet gains to argue that the United States had lost its sense of purpose and that we needed to kind of reinvigorate to be able to win this Cold War. And him, along with his wife, Jackie Kennedy, who was beautiful and youthful, showed that Kennedy himself was youthful and vigorous and up for a new vision, up for the challenge of the Cold War. In another interesting turn of fate that deals with the television in U.S. politics, 1960 is the first time that we have a televised debate between the two nominees. And it's really interesting that television really kind of saved Richard Nixon in the 1952 campaign with his checkers speech, but television hurt him in 1960 in this debate against Kennedy. What's interesting is that when both Kennedy and Nixon get to the studio to where they're going to do their debate and have it broadcasted, Kennedy was offered makeup to wear for the cameras, and Nixon refused. Nixon was also kind of recovering from a cold. And so if the people who watched the debate thought that Kennedy won, but people who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon won, because Nixon on the television came across as kind of like cold and a little sickly looking, and Kennedy looked really youthful and vibrant. So he kind of, Nixon appeared tired and kind of nervous. And so Kennedy really gained a lot of strength because of this. Television really helped Kennedy, and it hurt Nixon in this situation. Kennedy ultimately won the election by 120,000 votes in the popular vote. But the underpinnings of 1950s life, that idea of consumerism and consensus and little bit of dissent, kind of falls into disarray as the 1960s begin. There's a lot of kind of new things that are being brought into the public consciousness. Cars were spewing lead because we still had lead in gasoline. That's why our gasoline now says unleaded, because there's no lead in our gasoline anymore. So cars are spewing lead because of gasoline. Los Angeles had so much smog. I mean, they still do today, but they had a lot of smog due to pollution from cars. We see the emergence of CFCs, which are in people's air conditioning and their deodorants and aerosols that are releasing chemicals into the atmosphere. Insecticides in agriculture were poisoning farm workers, poisoning consumers, poisoning our water supply. Housewives are starting to rebel against the suburban dream. Blacks are impatient with the slow progress of racial change. And so all of these things start to emerge in the late 50s and into the early 60s. And it's a sign of what is to come, because while the 1960s continues to be a part of the golden age of capitalism, it is very much a time of major social upheaval. And we will get into that in the coming weeks.